In the world of Genshin Impact, nothing can be as mysterious, but at the same time as intriguing as the concept of meta. First of all, what does meta even mean, and how does it apply to the context of Genshin? The meaning of meta is most effective tactic available, and in games it typically refers to the best way to do or build a certain thing. This definition in a game like Genshin can be applied to several things. A character can have a meta build, a team concept can have meta characters, and a specific Abyss cycle can have meta teams. This last aspect of the game is probably the easiest to define a clear meta on, as Genshin itself provides a metric to evaluate team performance in Abyss, namely clear time. The presence of this factor allowed speedruns to become reality, and nowadays there are several communities of players that dedicate most of their Genshin-related efforts to these achievements alone. As a theory crafter, I personally find speedruns really interesting, because they're optimal ways to show the limits of theoretical analysis and emphasize the importance of practical experience. In fact, the theoretical analysis on a team-wide scale mostly focuses on fixed rotations that repeat on an infinite loop to generate estimates of the team's DPS and DPR. This method is a useful way to provide general conclusions about a team, like estimates of energy recharge, damage potential, and best builds, but what it fails at is providing an accurate guide for Abyss scenarios. In a perfect world, the team with the highest DPS should also be the one to perform the best in Abyss. Reality, however, is quite different, as dynamic game situations introduce problems such as HP thresholds and the varying AoE situations, things you just can't take into account through a generalized method. For this reason, speedruns and Abyss showcases in general have always been the main way to learn about specific rotations for teams, as in those situations players can exactly gauge how effective the strategy they used is by the amount of time it took them to clear the stage. There are several levels of speedruns: high-end whale levels, high constellations levels, dolphin level, and even free-to-play level. In particular, I recently took interest on a Chinese speedrun site, Muskreef. This website organizes speedruns in a peculiar way. It categorizes them through the amount of 5-star weapons, 5-star characters, and 5-star constellations are present on the speedrunning team. Each of those things count as a gold, and 4 golds is what's typically seen as mid-range speedrunning, so a level everybody can reach by focusing their expenses towards a specific goal. So, I had an idea. I thought it would be interesting to take some of the best 4 gold speedruns from this site and put them side by side with Theorycrafting conclusions I reached about those teams at a standardized level, and then see how much changes if I increase that level to match what's happening in-game, from an investment perspective. By doing this, I can show how much damage difference there is between the investment standard that's used in Theorycrafting circles and the investment level dedicated players can reach, and I can also highlight the limit of fixed rotations Theorycrafting. For context, by standardized level I mean a derivation of KQM main standards, which are 4-star weapons across the board, Constellation 0 for 5 stars and 6 for 4 stars, and a limit of 40 substats in total on artifacts, 20 of those being evenly distributed by default across the 10 stats in the game, and 20 being freely distributable, but with a few restraints. Without further ado, let's check some speedruns together. As a premise, the runs that will be shown only consider the top side of the Abyss, as it's generally easier to get a continuous run on the top side as opposed to the second side due to how Abyss resets work. The first run I analyze is also the one that has been by far the best in this cycle clear time wise. Quickbloom Constellation 2 Nahida with Fischl, Raiden and Shincho. I know some of you might be shocked by this composition, as there are 2 main Hyperbloom variants, on-field Nahida with double Hydro, or Quickbloom with off-field Nahida and a carry like Sino or a Haitham. On the other hand, this composition uses on-field Nahida Quickbloom, and for a good reason. Here, the 4 goals are reached by using Constellation to Nahida and Raiden. Technically, a viable alternative would have been swapping Raiden out for Yelan and Fischl out for Cookie, but let me explain why this might not exactly be optimal. First of all, double Hydro Hyperbloom comps generally waste a lot of seeds, as Yelan and Xingqiu provide so much Hydro up that you'll often end up proccing more than 2 Hyperblooms per Electro attack, meaning that some of the application's potential gets wasted. For this reason, using just Xingqiu as opposed to the Hydro duo isn't really that much of a loss in terms of actual Hyperbloom's impact. Secondarily, Raiden's long duration skills fits better alongside a character like Xingqiu, which can provide a huge Hydro up for 18 seconds. Raiden Hyperbloom teams can fit 25 seconds rotations, while Cookie teams have shorter rotations and smaller rotation damage. In this specific run scenario, the 25 seconds rotation fits like a glove, as the player ended up clearing several rooms in around that time, meaning that the longer uptime was beneficial. However, a big reason this was possible for the speedrunner is because he had a very high investment level. In fact, at Constellation 0, this team is pretty good, but doesn't really stand out if compared to other Hyperbloom variants, as a standardized Nahida isn't really strong enough to take advantage of Quicken here. The Nahida this dude is using, however, is a completely different beast. Not only she's Constellation 2, but the artifacts she's using are completely bonkers, as she has 17 more beneficial substats than the common Theorycraft scenario. Moreover, this Nahida is using Widsit, which is a high-risk, high-reward weapon due to its random effect, but that can be great if you can manipulate its consistency through resets, which is commonly done in speedruns. As a result, Nahida ends up reaching massive DPS levels if compared to her standards, and the composition ends up stomping this Abyss cycle through both high damage ceiling and extreme flexibility thanks to its quick swap structure. In terms of rotations, there isn't much difference between this specific example and theory-crafted rotations, because this is a team that's entirely based on sustained damage, with basically no way to frontload any part of it for specific situations. The second run I'll show is an Haitham Quickbloom composition, which I thought would be nice to use as a comparison for the previous Nahida run. Compared to that, this run was 9 seconds lower. There are 2 main reasons. 1. The composition is less flexible, as on-field Nahida fares better in extreme multi-wave scenarios such as the first chamber with 4 Ruin Guards. On this run, the speedrunner thought it was better to avoid using Haitham for the first Ruin Guard altogether. This, however, would be less of an issue if Haitham had enough damage to compensate for that, which brings us to the second issue. In fact, this Haitham's investment level is quite lackluster if compared to the previous Nahida, as it's very close to the investment level you see on standardized theory-crafting results. In my opinion, if Haitham somehow had the same artifact levels as that Nahida, then the runs would have been closer, although on-field Nahida would still have the edge because of how well that team's single rotation length fit with these Abyss rooms. In comparison, this Haitham team almost always has to start a second rotation due to Cookie's lower uptime as opposed to Raiden's, which adds downtime to the runs and ultimately makes it inferior. In terms of rotation differences, most Quickbloom Haitham teams generally don't split Haitham's windows in 2 parts, as the downtime between the 2 windows can ruin the viability of limited uptime skills such as Cookies. For this reason, instead of splitting rotations, the speedrunner here is sometimes forced to preemptively end his first rotation to fit a multi-wave situation, like it happens in the second chamber. The third run revolves around a character that recently had a resurgence thanks to the arrival of his dedicated support, Xiao. Xiao is a character that does really well in the context of 4 golds, because he only really needs his signature weapon in terms of 5-star investment on his team. Other than him, this run features a Constellation 1 Xiao, and while the Constellation helps in some situations, it's not really a big deal. For the rest, since Xiao teams are sustained for the most part, There aren't many differences between the rotations used on tape and what you can predict through Theorycrafting, as it's mostly supports set up and then Xiao plunges. In the first chamber, the speedrunner decides to avoid pre-funneling particles through elemental skills before Xiao's burst. The reason he does this is because the Ruin Guards drop enough white particles that it will be alright regardless of pre-funnel. Instead, he uses them to perfectly fit enemies' HP thresholds through attacks when possible. Another practical difference is about how many collisions Xiao can get in this run. In fact, by physically falling on an opponent's hitbox after a plunge, Xiao can inflict extra plunge damage. This isn't hard to achieve consistently against big enemies and bosses in general, and in this run it helps Xiao in the second and third chamber specifically, where consecrated beasts and the algorithm just get melted by his attacks. This run's investment level isn't even particularly high, as Xiao's artifacts are good, but not as incredible as the Nahida I've shown before, and since the only real gold requirement here is a standard pull 5-star weapon, this run is probably the most free-to-play friendly out of the bunch here, pretty impressive for a character that was considered low tier before Feruzan's release. The fourth run is about Raiden National. This theme is interesting, because generally in speedruns it's at least a bit slower than the Raiden Hyper carry variant. However, for this abyss specifically, the first chamber kind of shuts that theme down by having an electro protection field. Meanwhile, Raiden National can easily deal with that through Xianling's continuous pyro up on burst, so it ends up being faster this time around. This run in particular emphasizes on the strength in numbers side of things, as the golds on this team are used for Xianling's and Bennett's weapons, and the artifact investment level is extremely high across the board. In fact, National team seeding is usually hard to increase due to how evenly the damage is distributed on this comp, but this speedrunner managed to do that by just hyperinvesting on every character on the team, so props to him. Notable differences you might find compared to other Raiden National rotations are Bennett holding the instructor set, and Shincho using a powered up elemental skill before Raiden takes the field with her burst, which helps the team front load the damage more and take care of an opponent wave, like it happens in the first chamber with the first Ruin Guard. The fifth run is about Hutao Vape. The surprising thing here is the speedrunner picking Kazuha over Yelan, so a type of composition that favors Hutao's damage over anything else. Personally, I don't think Double Hydro would have performed much worse, but this one is still interesting. Kazuha in particular doesn't use his elemental burst much, because if you want to infuse it with Hydro, it requires a longer setup, and its damage isn't really worth the time spent. On the other hand, the speedrunner ends up using it with Pyro Infusion sometimes, presumably to increase the AoE potential of the comp, like in the second chamber. This Hutao never uses her elemental burst, as she's using the Shimenawa set. This composition's rotation damage is frankly not the highest, even at investment level this guy is using it at, as it fails to reach 2 million of rotation output even if he tries to crit fish like in the algorithm chamber. Things could have been different if he could have swapped out Shincho for Yelan for single target, but theoreticals are not easy to argue in the context of speedruns. For the rest, in terms of damage calculation, this is the weakest composition of the video so far, and yet it managed to stay in range with other teams, which can be the result of the team damage being focused so much on Hutao, which makes its overall output less randomic. The sixth and last run of this video is about Ayaka Monocryo. Ayaka is rather infamous as a character who has been suffering recently in Genshin due to abyss structures that didn't really benefit Fried's compositions at all. However, against heavy enemies that don't get pushed around by her elemental burst, she can still perform pretty well, granted her positioning throughout the run is proper. Specifically, the hyper comp the speedrunner is using really benefits a lot from Missplitter and hyper investment on Ayaka, as it's pretty much the difference between the comp being remarkably slow and speedrun worthy. For the rest, positioning here is particularly important in the first chamber, where each Ayaka burst ends up being enough to kill 2 Ruin Guards. Chen He's Constellation 1 is used here, which helps the overall energy economy of the team, and also allows the speedrunner to use the hold version of the elemental skill, while still comfortably being able to manage her cooldowns. I'm not quite sure if that extra Constellation is better than swapping Sucrose out for Kazuha here, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, also because this is the highest ranking Ayaka speedrun on the site. Still, the rotation damage here is not the highest, and this is the team that ended up performing worst in single target scenarios, so in the third chamber against the boss, regardless, a great performance, and a good showcase for all the Ayaka players who think she has absolutely no use without freeze. And that's it. This was just a fun little experiment from me. I just analyzed 6 runs, because Theorycrafting rotations and results for all of them at both the standardized level and speedrun level takes quite the effort, so I just wanted to analyze a few and see if you will like this type of video. Personally, I believe that the world of speedrunning level optimization can be a mystery to many players, and since I had a lot of fun doing this, I'm open to bringing more of this content to you all in the future. I'm done for today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time!